Today, 5 reasons in which MMA in general, and the UFC in particular, discriminates against grapplers in their competition. Now, grappling, of course, is what started the UFC. Royce Gracie, the legacy of Royce Gracie is amazing in the UFC. But nowadays, you see more and more strikers and the prevalence of strikers and the bringing up of strikers. When you see the highlight reel at the beginning of a UFC, it's mostly big KOs. You see guys apologizing for winning by submission as opposed to winning by KO. So what's happened to create this environment in which striking is prioritized or elevated over grappling? It's not a universal thing. There are exceptions. Ronda Rousey's a pretty big exception. She was a pretty big draw for the UFC. But for every one Ronda Rousey, there's 10 Wonderboy Thompsons, right? So there's definitely a bias. So reason number 1 is gloves. The gloves that they wear and the hand wraps that they put on make punching much more powerful. Gloves are not to protect your opponent. Gloves are to protect the hand and allow you to hit harder. If you doubt this, why don't you go try punching a cinder block wall with your bare fist as hard as you can and as many times as you can, and then go wrap it up with gauze and tape and put the glove on top of it and see if you can hit the wall longer and harder. The answer is yes. Gloves are not to protect the person getting hit. They are to allow you to hit harder. Gloves also make it harder to sneak a hand in there to choke. Gloves make grappling harder. So simultaneously, they make it easier for strikers and they make it harder for grapplers. Number 2, it's rounds. The early UFC was 1 round. So if you took me down, we would be down on that ground for however long the fight lasted, unless I stood back up. So there was Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie. It wasn't a very exciting fight, but it was 30 minutes mostly on the ground of Ken on top, Royce on the bottom, but they stayed down. In the modern UFC, they would have at minimum had 5 stand-ups if it had been a title fight, right? It would have started on the feet, and then each subsequent round would have started on their feet. So if you and I are fighting and I end up in a terrible position on the ground, depending on where we are in the round, my option might be simply to be defensive, to cover my neck, to defend against strikes, and just ride out the clock till the end of the round when I know we're going to get back to our feet. It's not like every second round starts on the ground. No, every round starts on his feet. This is a bias towards the striker. The third reason is related, and that's where do the breakups happen? When do they stand people up? Well, they stand people up when they're on the ground. If the fight's boring on the ground, if nothing's happening, they stand both fighters up. It's not like if they're standing and the fight's boring and it's just 2 guys circling each other, doing head fakes, circling. It's not like they take those guys and put them on the ground. The stand-ups, the changes in fighting modality only happen from the ground to going up. Similarly, there's the breaking up of clinches. Just like they break up boring fights on the ground, if we're clinching up against the fence, there might be a lot going on. We might be spending a lot of energy. I might subtly be fighting to get a certain angle or a certain grip and setting you up. Doesn't matter. If nothing overtly exciting is happening, they separate clinches. So they break you up on the ground and they separate clinches. Another reason is financial. So who gets the fight of the night bonuses? Is it Damian Maia, who's a jiu-jitsu god, or is it some super flashy striker who lands the big KO, the big flying knee, the big running up the fence and kicking the head off of the opponent? Although he did deserve that fight of the night bonus, there's no question. So there's a financial push towards people who put asses in the seats. Who puts asses in the seats? It's the big KOs. What puts asses in the seats? It's the big knockouts. It's the big fancy kicks. It's the big striking combinations. It's somebody going down like they've been hit with an axe, falling down. That's what makes the highlight reel at the beginning of the UFC. That's who gets the big money in the fight of the night bonuses. So if you and I are fighting and you figure that you've got equal chances of taking me down and choking me out or knocking me out, which are you going to go for? You're going to go for the knockout. That'd be smart of you, because it'll put more money in your pocket. And finally, is who does the UFC sign in the first place? Yes, they definitely do sign some high-level judoka and some high-level wrestlers. Khabib or Ronda Rousey, for sure. Those guys do come in. Those guys are brought in. But for every one grappler that they bring in 2 or 3 strikers. They bring in some amazing guy who's got an amazing highlight reel from other smaller events. And then who do they re-sign? Who gets their contract extended? Who gets their contract terminated early? And there's definitely a bias there towards the guys who are striking. The punchers, the kickers, the knee guys, the elbow guys. Those guys, a little bit more than the grapplers, get their contracts renewed. So those are 5 ways in which the UFC biases the game, not completely, but pretty significantly towards striking over grappling, especially when you compare it to the early days of the 1993, 94, 95, the early UFC that got all of this started and put so many people into jiu-jitsu class, into submission grappling class, and into MMA training class.